Hi, everyone. This is Suzanne Etkin with a quick presentation on soils. We could certainly spend a whole semester talking about soils, and people who spend their whole lives learning about soils and studying soils know so little about what is right underneath of our feet. But today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to boil down three aspects of soils that are important for your work as a watershed steward. So, we're going to talk about the composition of soil, the particle size, and the compaction. First of all, it's important to understand that soil is made up significantly of air and water. So, what's actually in between those particles of soil is as important as the particles themselves. And when the proper amount of air and water is missing from soils, it can have big impacts on a soil's ability to infiltrate water or support plant life. Importantly, organic matter, while it composes only about 5% of the soil, is a really important piece. And we can find a lot of soil in the urban and suburban environment that has very little organic matter. It's important to understand that about 80% of that organic matter is actually decomposing plants and animal parts, providing food for your plants. About 10% is organisms and about 10% is roots. And then lastly, 45% are actually those mineral particles from the bedrock that soil is made of. The living things in soil are really important and very diverse and very numerous. A teaspoon of productive soil can have 1 million to 1 billion bacteria. And likewise, soil, again, in that suburban and urban environment, can have very little living things. And that can become quite a problem when you're trying to support plant life on top. That's why it's really important to consider very carefully your use and your community's use of herbicides and pesticides. Typically, there aren't studies done on the effect of herbicides and pesticides on soil organisms, but it stands to reason that if it's killing things above the ground, it will kill things below the ground. And it can have a big effect on particularly your lawn. If you want to grow nice green grass, the last thing you want to do is to kill the organic living community that's helping to support your lawn. So you can actually be causing more problems on your lawn by applying herbicides and pesticides. Those things, those living things in soil, help to cycle nutrients. They make micronutrients available for plants. So they're really, really important. So, how is soil formed? One statistic that I always find so shocking is that it can take 500 to 1,000 years to make 1 inch of soil. It's a very long process, and there's a lot of factors that affect that process and can make it go slower or faster. But the point is that it takes a very long time. What you can see from this soil profile is that there's different layers of soil. They're called soil horizons. Not particularly important for your work as a watershed steward. However, whenever homes are built, typically that the fill dirt that is used, compacted and used to build up home sites is the least valuable soil. And so it's typically not the topsoil, which is useful, for the lawn areas. But a lot of times you'll have layers and layers of sort of the lower horizons of soils that can actually be brought to the surface during development. And what that leaves you with is often lawns that are trying to grow on soil that has very little organic matter, which can be an issue. Next on to the particle size. So the particle size, we're talking about the soil, the mineral particles. There's basically three categories of particle size. Clay is your smallest, signified by that little red dot on the screen. Silt is the next biggest, the green, and then sand is your largest particle size. Sorry, the clay is actually a little teeny dot. The silt is the red, and then sand is the larger. So particle size can vary quite a bit, and the size of the particles is how they determine the hydrologic group. So the hydrologic group, A, B, C, and D, you probably saw on the GIS as you were looking on it. And hydrologic group is a classification that is basically designed to explain how well a soil will drain water. Hydrologic group A, these are well drained soils that contain mainly sand, a whole lot of sand. And you can imagine if you have very big particle sizes, so if we go back to the particle size chart, if all of your particles are very large, like the coarse sand or even the green medium sand, if you put those together, there's a lot of space in between them. And so water can sink down through those and infiltrate rather well. Hydrologic group B is a mix of sand and silt. So it also contains a lot of gaps in between those particle sizes and tends to be fairly well drained. So water will sink into group B soils. When you get to group C, that's soil with a lot of clay, so a lot of finer grained particles, and that soil tends to impede the flow of water, hold water. If you think of a clay pot, that's going to be pretty watertight. Group C soils are not as tight as a clay pot, but they do impede the flow of water. And then D are soils that have very low infiltration rates. And that can be because they have a lot of clay, they might be right next to a high water table. So for building rain gardens, A and B soil are going to be your go-to soil types. Um, there have been some rain gardens built in type C soil, but you have to do a careful percolation test, which we'll be talking about later. And you have to really make sure that that soil is going to drain. So, why is it helpful to know what hydrologic group you have when you're planning a rainscaping project? It's exactly because you want to know how well the water will be able to flow through the soil. And if you're collecting water in a space like a rain garden, you want to make sure that that soil can absorb the water and that water can pass down through. Importantly, it's really important to understand that you cannot change the hydrologic group of soil. You can't add by adding larger particle size, for example, if you add sand to, let's say, a type C soil, what you end up doing is actually by mixing different particle sizes together, you actually create soil with fewer holes, with fewer spots for air and water. Because what happens is the clay gets down into the space in between the sand particles, and it just creates almost an impervious surface, like concrete, for example. So you can't really change the hydrologic soil group you have. You can replace the soil in a rain garden, so dig it all out and put new soil in. But the bottom, the soil beneath your rain garden is still going to be that same hydrologic group. So you really, it's really important to work with what you have and to put the right kind of rainscaping project on the soil that you have. Next, we're going to talk about compaction, which is something that you can change. So, soil can become compacted in a number of ways. It can become compacted when houses are built, when heavy machinery is run over the lot to compact the soil for the building site, and that many of our urban and suburban lawns are it's hard to grow grass because that soil is compacted from the machinery that's on it. When or it can become compacted if you play sports on an area, so sports fields can be compacted, or if there's a pathway where people walk, it can become compacted. When soil becomes compacted, there's very little room for air or water, and it's hard for roots to get hold. And so when soil is compacted, you often see um, water that runs off or water that doesn't drain, or plants, particularly grass, that doesn't grow very well because those roots have a hard time breaking through that compacted area. If you do have very compacted soil, you can do a couple of different things. The most effective thing is simply to plant deep-rooted plants that have big roots that can help break up the compacted soil. In the urban I mean, in the agricultural sector, they till or rip soil, so they actually use a machine to break up the compaction. They also plant radishes or other tuber cover crops, and that helps to break up the compacted soil. So this little graph here uh, just symbolizes what I'm talking about in terms of the space in between the different particle sizes. So you can see right now a number of different soil particles, and they have some space for air and water. And when compaction happens, you lose that space. And again, here's a visual of those plant roots. Some of our deep rooted native plants can actually have roots that grow fairly deep and can help reduce the compaction of soil and thus help it to absorb more water. So, what we want to know is what are the factors that might affect soil drainage? How well soil drains is a measure of where is the water table. If the water table is within 2 feet of the surface, we certainly suggest that you not install a rain garden. But obviously, if there's a high water table, there isn't going to be space for more water to go. If the soil is compacted, if the soil is composed of mainly clay, that might affect the drainage. And if the soil is not healthy, meaning if it doesn't have a good mix of organic material, all of those things can affect how well the soil drains on a site. So, taking a look at your water table, compaction, soil composition, and soil health is an important part of making sure of helping a site to slow down, spread out, and soak in stormwater. So how can we tell if our soil is healthy? Well, there's a couple of different investigations that as a watershed steward, you will know how to do. The first is to take a look at what the expected soil type is. And again, this is the GIS system. We went on and identified the soil layer, and you can see here that we have soil group B, which is that second soil group, and we think that the soil in this particular area is fairly well drained. So it should be able to absorb, just by composition, it should be able to absorb stormwater. If you want more information about the soil group, you can also go to the USDA's Web Soil Survey. That website has a whole lot more information about the expected soil type on site, and I'm giving you the link to the Web Soil Survey at the end of this presentation. Regardless of the expected soil type, you'll also want to do a percolation test. We're going to do a percolation test a little bit later in the course. On page 34 of Rain Gardens Across Maryland, you can find a couple of different percolation tests. The one I like the most, if you're going to install a rain garden, and again, you don't need to do a percolation test necessarily if you're not doing a rain garden, but the easiest test for a rain garden is to dig a hole about 12 inches wide and about 24 inches deep. Fill that hole with water, and if it drains within 48 hours, you've got good enough soil drainage to build a rain garden. If it doesn't, then you want to think maybe about an alternative to a rain garden. If it's been very dry, if you're in a dry part of the year, like August, for example, you'll want to actually fill up your hole with water twice. So fill it up once, let it drain all the way down, and then fill it up again. And the reason for that is that your first um, filling of that soil, the water could just be going into the soil around to the side of the hole instead of infiltrating down because the soil is so dry. But percolation tests are very easy to do. And again, we'll demonstrate one later in the course. Another place that you can get information about soil is by having your soil tested. The Home and Garden Information Center has a lot of information about soil tests, how to do them, where to send them, how to read the results of a soil test. A soil test is basically going to be able to tell you what your soil is composed of, what the level of various nutrients is in your soil, what the pH is of your soil. And if you tell the soil testing lab what you would like to do with your soil, they'll give you recommendations. So, for example, are you testing your soil so that you can have a um, a vegetable garden? Are you testing it to grow grass? Are you testing it for another reason? So a soil test is something that people sometimes do, especially if they're having trouble on a site with getting grass to grow or getting other things to go grow. Getting a soil test can be very helpful. So again, as we wrap up this presentation, three characteristics of soil that affect your rainscaping decisions: the soil composition, the particle size, and compaction. And again, remember that particle size is not going to be something that you can change. You can affect the compaction by planting deep rooted plants or adding organic material. And then that composition of the soil, again, you're not going to be able to make a lot of changes except by encouraging. Um, Organic material, maybe by adding a little bit of compost or growing plants on that soil. Last, here are some resources that might be helpful for you to explore as you learn a little bit more about your soil. The National Resource Conservation Service, the Home and Garden Information Center, and the Web Soil Survey.